Ethan Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, the soft hum of the city outside failing to drown out the storm in his mind. His once bright eyes, full of dreams and determination, now looked hollow. On the table before him sat an envelope from his lawyer, a reminder of the nightmare that had consumed the past year of his life. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but stopped short, as if opening it would make everything more real. The truth was already real, though, and it was disturbing. At 25, Ethan had been chasing dreams bigger than himself. An aspiring musician with raw talent but little direction, he had spent years performing at dingy bars, playing his heart out for crowds that barely noticed. Success felt like a distant fantasy until the night she walked into his life. Maggie Sinclair. She was 65, but her presence was magnetic. With silver hair perfectly coiffed and an aura of wealth and sophistication, she commanded attention wherever she went. That night, she approached Ethan after his set, her piercing blue eyes locking onto him like a hawk spotting prey. "You've got something special," she said, her voice smooth, almost motherly. "You shouldn't waste it in places like this." Ethan, flattered and eager to escape his struggles, thanked her nervously. When she handed him her card, the name Margaret Sinclair was embossed in gold letters, accompanied by a logo for an exclusive event planning company. "Come to my estate this weekend," she said with a smile. "I'd love to discuss your career." It seemed too good to be true. Zoe, his best friend, thought so too. She warned him, her tone sharp with suspicion. "Ethan, you don't even know this woman. People like that don't just hand out opportunities for free." But Ethan brushed off her concerns. Maggie wasn't just anyone. She was a gatekeeper to the kind of life he had always dreamed of. Lavish parties, important connections, and, most importantly, a chance to get his music heard. How could he say no? The following weekend, Maggie's estate took his breath away. A sprawling mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. It looked like something out of a movie. Inside, the wealth was overwhelming. Artwork on every wall, marble floors, and a grand piano that gleamed under a crystal chandelier. Maggie greeted him with a warm smile and a glass of champagne. She introduced him to her guests as her protégé, a word that made Ethan swell with pride. But as the night wore on, Ethan began to feel something unsettling beneath Maggie's charm. Her compliments grew more personal, her touch lingering longer than it should. When she rested her hand on his arm and leaned in close, her words slurred slightly from the champagne. Ethan felt the first flicker of discomfort. It was subtle at first, a compliment that felt too intimate, a favor that came with strings attached. Ethan told himself it was nothing. After all, Maggie had offered him everything he thought he wanted. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was falling into something he didn't understand. And he had no idea how far it would go. The days following that evening at Maggie's estate were a blur of opportunity and confusion for Ethan. True to her word, Maggie began introducing him to people in the industry, producers, executives, and influencers who could change his life with a single phone call. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was breaking through the invisible barrier that had always kept him on the fringes of success. But with every door Maggie opened, her presence loomed larger over his life. "Ethan, darling, I'll handle the arrangements for your next gig," Maggie said one afternoon as they sat in the living room of her estate. She lounged comfortably on an antique chaise, her fingers delicately swirling a glass of wine. "These industry types are ruthless. You need someone who knows how to protect you." Ethan hesitated. He had always handled his own bookings, limited as they were, but Maggie's connections had undeniably elevated him to places he could never reach on his own. "I appreciate it, Maggie," he replied cautiously, "but I don't want to burden you." "Nonsense," she said with a dismissive wave. "You're family now. Let me take care of you." The word family hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Ethan couldn't pinpoint why it made him uncomfortable, but he pushed the thought aside. After all, Maggie's influence was making things happen. He couldn't afford to upset her. Yet, over time, Maggie's help began to feel more like control. She insisted on reviewing his set lists, dictating which events he should attend, and even suggesting who he should associate with, or avoid. If Ethan pushed back, her demeanor shifted. The warm, nurturing tone disappeared, replaced by a sharpness that sent chills down his spine. "You don't understand how the game works," she would say, her eyes narrowing. "If you don't listen to me, you'll ruin everything." Ethan often found himself nodding in silence, swallowing his doubts. He told himself that this was just the price of success, but Zoe wasn't buying it. "Ethan, this woman is controlling your entire life," Zoe said one evening as they sat in his tiny apartment. "Can't you see that?" "She's helping me," Ethan replied defensively. "I wouldn't have gotten half these opportunities without her." "But at what cost?" Zoe shot back, her frustration palpable. "She's isolating you, Ethan. Do you even make any decisions for yourself anymore?" Ethan avoided her gaze, unwilling to admit that Zoe might be right. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I owe her. She's done so much for me." Zoe leaned forward, her voice softening. "You don't owe her your life, Ethan. Just be careful, okay? Something about her feels off." Ethan nodded, but he didn't truly process her words. Deep down, a part of him already knew that Maggie's generosity came with strings, but he wasn't ready to confront the truth. It was late one night after a successful gig that Maggie threw in Ethan's honor. The party had dwindled, leaving only a handful of guests lingering in the sprawling living room. Ethan sat on the couch, exhausted but exhilarated. Maggie appeared beside him, a fresh glass of champagne in hand. "You were incredible tonight," she said, her voice low and intimate. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Maggie," Ethan replied, trying to hide his discomfort as she leaned closer. Her hand rested on his knee, a touch that lingered just a moment too long. "You're special, Ethan. You know that, don't you?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing for a way to change the subject. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quickly, forcing a smile. Maggie's eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. "You've given me purpose again," she said softly. "More than you realize." The moment was broken by the sound of a guest calling for Maggie from across the room. She pulled back, but not before giving Ethan's knee a lingering squeeze. That night, as Ethan lay in the guest room of Maggie's estate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. He told himself he was imagining things, but the unease settled deep in his chest. As weeks turned into months, Maggie's grip on Ethan's life tightened. She discouraged him from attending events without her, claiming she needed to protect him from people who didn't have his best interests at heart. She also began criticizing his friendships, particularly his closeness with Zoe. "She's jealous of your success," Maggie said one afternoon, as Ethan mentioned Zoe's latest warning. "You need to surround yourself with people who uplift you, not tear you down." Ethan wanted to argue, but Maggie's words wormed their way into his mind. He began canceling plans with Zoe, convinced that Maggie's support was all he needed. But the more Maggie isolated him, the more Ethan began to lose himself. His music, once a source of joy, started to feel like a chore. His confidence waned, replaced by a nagging sense of dependence. He was no longer sure where Maggie's influence ended and his decisions began. It was after another party at Maggie's estate that Ethan woke up disoriented in the guest room. His head throbbed, and his memories of the night before were hazy. He remembered Maggie pouring him drinks and insisting he relax, but everything else was a blur. As he sat up, a wave of nausea hit him. He noticed his shirt was unbuttoned, though he distinctly remembered buttoning it before going to bed. Panic bubbled in his chest, but he quickly suppressed it. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her expression calm and casual. "Good morning, darling," she said with a smile. "Rough night?" Ethan forced a laugh, trying to push past the unease. "Yeah, I guess I had a bit too much." "You were the life of the party," Maggie said, stepping closer. "You've come such a long way. I'm so proud of you." She leaned in to kiss his forehead, and Ethan froze. Her touch felt invasive, but he didn't know how to pull away without offending her. As the day went on, Ethan tried to brush off his discomfort, but the lingering doubt gnawed at him. Something wasn't right, but he didn't know how to voice it, or who would believe him if he did. The turning point came during an industry gala that Maggie had arranged for Ethan to attend. It was supposed to be his big break, a chance to perform for top executives and secure a record deal. But when Maggie introduced him to the crowd, she didn't call him her protégé. She called him her partner. Ethan's stomach churned as murmurs rippled through the room. He wanted to correct her, to clarify that their relationship was strictly professional, but the words caught in his throat. Maggie's hand rested possessively on his arm, and her smile dared him to challenge her. That night, Ethan confronted her for the first time. "Why would you call me that?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Maggie's expression darkened. "I've done everything for you, Ethan. Without me, you'd still be playing in those sad little bars. You owe me." "I never asked for this," Ethan shouted. "You're suffocating me." Maggie's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "You'll regret saying that. Do you think anyone else will take you seriously without me? I made you, Ethan, and I can break you." Ethan stormed out, but Maggie's words followed him. He realized just how deeply she had entangled herself in his life. Cutting ties wouldn't be easy, but he knew he couldn't stay under her control any longer. For the first time in months, Ethan called Zoe. When he told her everything, her voice was a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Ethan, you need to get out of this. Now." "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice cracking. "She has so much power over me. She's already spreading rumors in the industry. No one will work with me." "Then we'll fight back," Zoe said firmly. "But you can't do this alone." Zoe connected Ethan with Detective Carla Monroe, who specialized in cases of manipulation and exploitation. As Ethan recounted his experiences, he felt a strange mix of relief and shame. "You're not alone in this," Detective Monroe assured him. "People like Maggie rely on fear and silence, but if we work together, we can expose her." As Detective Monroe delved into Maggie's past, disturbing patterns emerged. Ethan wasn't her first victim. Several young men had been lured into her web over the years. Their careers quietly derailed when they tried to break free. Some had signed non-disclosure agreements in exchange for settlements, while others had simply disappeared from the industry altogether. Ethan's case was the first to challenge her publicly. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Maggie's wealth and connections gave her immense power, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The courtroom was packed. Rows of faces, some sympathetic, others judgmental, filled the space. Their whispers and murmurs muted only by the weight of the proceedings. Ethan Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together. Zoe sat beside him, her steady presence an anchor in the storm. Across the room, Maggie Sinclair sat with her legal team, her composure cold and unyielding. She wore the same air of superiority that had once made Ethan feel small, but now it only fueled his determination. This was it, the culmination of months of pain, fear, and uncertainty. Today, Ethan would finally reclaim his voice. The prosecution's case painted a chilling picture of manipulation, control, and exploitation. Detective Carla Monroe, now a key witness, outlined Maggie's calculated pattern of targeting young, vulnerable men under the guise of mentorship. She presented evidence of financial coercion, emotional manipulation, and career sabotage, tactics designed to keep her victims compliant and isolated. Ethan's testimony was raw and honest. He spoke about the initial allure of Maggie's promises, the way she had positioned herself as a benefactor, and how her generosity slowly morphed into control. He recounted the nights he woke up disoriented, the lingering touches, and the psychological toll of being told he owed her everything. "I thought she was helping me," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But she wasn't building me up. She was tearing me down so I'd never leave her shadow." The defense attempted to discredit him, leaning heavily on societal biases that often dismiss male victims of exploitation. They painted Maggie as a generous, misunderstood woman whose kindness had been misconstrued. "Isn't it true that Ms. Sinclair financed your career and gave you opportunities you never would have had on your own?" her lawyer asked, his tone sharp. "She did," Ethan admitted, his voice firm. "But those opportunities came with a price. My independence, my dignity, and my trust. That's not generosity, that's control." The most damning evidence came from other victims. Detective Monroe had tracked down 2 men who had previously been ensnared by Maggie's web. One was a former model whose career had been derailed when he refused her advances. The other was a struggling actor who described eerily similar experiences to Ethan's: gifts, promises, and the eventual realization that he was little more than a pawn in her game. Their testimonies added weight to Ethan's case, painting a pattern of abuse that was impossible to ignore. Maggie's calm facade began to crack as her predatory behavior was laid bare. But it was Zoe's testimony that delivered the emotional blow. She spoke about watching her best friend's spark dim under Maggie's influence, how she had tried to pull him back before it was too late. "Ethan is the kindest, most talented person I know," Zoe said, her voice trembling with emotion, and Maggie took advantage of that. She saw his vulnerability and exploited it for her own gain. He's not just a victim, he's a survivor. The deliberation felt like an eternity. Ethan sat outside the courtroom, his mind racing with every possible outcome. Zoe sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you stood up for yourself. That's what matters." When the jury returned, the atmosphere was electric. The judge's voice cut through the tension as she read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Margaret Sinclair, liable for emotional and professional damages inflicted upon the plaintiff, Ethan Carter." Ethan exhaled sharply, a wave of relief washing over him. The judge's ruling included a financial settlement and mandated therapy for Maggie. But the true victory was in the acknowledgement of Ethan's truth. For the first time, his voice had been heard. Life didn't magically return to normal after the trial. The scars Maggie left, both emotional and professional, took time to heal. Some industry insiders were hesitant to work with Ethan, worried about the drama surrounding his case. But slowly, opportunities began to trickle in. A few producers reached out, impressed by his resilience and talent. Ethan's first performance after the trial was a small acoustic set at a local cafe. The room was packed, not with industry elites, but with people who had followed his story and believed in his journey. As he sang, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The music wasn't just about success anymore, it was about reclaiming his identity. Ethan's relationship with Zoe grew even stronger. She had been his rock throughout the ordeal, and he often joked that he owed her half his settlement. But their bond wasn't just about the trial, it was about the years of friendship that had carried them through life's toughest moments. Marcus, Ethan's older brother, also re-entered his life. Their relationship had been strained for years, but the trial had forced Marcus to confront his own biases about male vulnerability. "I didn't understand before," Marcus admitted one evening as they shared a drink, "but I see it now. What you went through, it was real, and I'm proud of you for standing up." Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding begin to lift. "Thanks, man. That means a lot." Months after the trial, Ethan received an unexpected letter from Maggie. She requested a meeting, claiming she wanted to apologize. Against Zoe's advice, Ethan agreed to see her, needing closure more than anything. They met in a quiet cafe. Maggie looked smaller, diminished, her once imposing presence now fragile. She began with pleasantries, but Ethan cut straight to the point. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice steady. "Why me? Why anyone?" Maggie hesitated, her eyes glistening with tears. "I was lonely," she admitted. "You reminded me of someone I used to love, someone I lost. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan. I didn't know how to let go." Ethan felt a flicker of sympathy, but quickly suppressed it. "Loneliness doesn't excuse what you did. You manipulated me. You took advantage of my trust." "I know," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Ethan stood, his resolve firm. "I hope you do, but I'm not here for your guilt, Maggie. I'm here to tell you that you don't own me anymore. I'm moving on." He walked away feeling lighter than he had in years. With the trial behind him, Ethan began using his platform to advocate for male victims of exploitation. He partnered with organizations that supported survivors, sharing his story to break the stigma surrounding male vulnerability. His music also took on a new depth. Songs about resilience, self-worth, and healing resonated with audiences, and Ethan's fan base grew steadily. He wasn't just a musician, he was a voice for those who felt silenced. A year later, Ethan stood on stage at a sold-out concert, the crowd cheering as he strummed the opening chords of his latest song. The lyrics spoke of struggle and survival, of finding light in the darkest places. As he sang, he felt a profound connection to the audience, a shared understanding of what it meant to rise above pain. Zoe watched from the wings, her eyes brimming with pride. Marcus stood beside her, clapping and cheering louder than anyone. Ethan caught their eyes and smiled, knowing he wouldn't have made it here without them. After the show, a young man approached Ethan backstage. He was nervous, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Your story, it gave me the courage to leave a bad situation. Thank you." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. Don't ever forget that." Ethan's journey wasn't just about overcoming Maggie's control. It was about reclaiming his identity and proving that vulnerability wasn't weakness. His story became a beacon for others, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of speaking out. And though the scars of the past would always remain, Ethan had found something stronger: hope for the future.